Last week on Data Point, we began a 2-week mini-series focused on unlocking the value for the patient in the consumer genomics marketplace with a conversation we had with Robin Thurston, the CEO of Helix. Definitely check that one out if you haven't heard it yet. This week, in the second part of that 2-part mini-series, we're going to be focused on unlocking the science. Hello and welcome to Data Point, the podcast where we focus on all the ways that data and analytics are driving innovation in healthcare. I'm your host, Greg Matthews, and today our guest is James Liu, the Chief Science Officer at Helix. He is both a medical doctor and a PhD with a focus in machine learning, genomics, neuroscience, and medicine. He has some fascinating ideas about the role genomics is going to play in changing the way that medicine is practiced in the future. Stick around, I think you'll enjoy this one. James, thanks so much for joining us on the Data Point podcast today.
I appreciate it, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So as our listeners know from last week's episode, we got a little bit of an introduction to the consumer genomic space from Robin Thurston, your colleague. But I am really curious to dig a little bit deeper into, some of the origin story with you as a co-founder of Helix, as well as some of your personal background. And I wonder, could we start there? Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be, the founder and chief scientist of a personal genomics company?
Yeah, happy to. I think maybe just starting from the beginning, I started my career as an engineer. So I was a chemical engineer at Stanford University and then spent a little bit of time in pharma after that. So I learned kind of through that process, I was very interested in, like we say, clinical care as well as fairly early stage technology development. And so I went back and trained as a physician scientist at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. And it was an amazing time to be there because Houston has one of the world's largest sequencing centers. And so when I was doing my PhD work, I was really learning and cutting my teeth on what was then some of the largest genomic data sets being generated in the world. Mm-hmm. And some of the early work that was starting to really bridge large-scale sequencing and its use in the clinic in particular to resolve some of the really hard-to-diagnose diseases in pediatrics. And so it was really focused on, can you employ exome sequencing to determine if there was even a genetic cause, and if we could identify that, is there a treatment for these children? And so I did a lot of that work, did a lot of algorithm work in that space, and then moved on and was really focused on the idea of leveraging data out of the medical records that would be generating every single day in the clinic and using that to discover new associations with disease, looking at that data for potential targets for therapeutic development, et cetera. And so I moved on and started a laboratory at Duke University where I was focused on this particular question and the algorithms around it. Meantime, we were thinking a lot about, what eventually became Helix. And I think we had the central insight that genomic data has these particularly unique features. One of them, which is this is data that's inherited from your parents. And so it's not changing through your life. Mm. And so ideally what you would do is you would sequence someone and allow that data to be used over and over again. As more we thought about that question of how would you enable a system where you would get sequenced once and essentially be able to query the data over and over again, it made a lot of sense to us that those data would be portable with an individual. That way they could take it to any place they need, for personal use, for clinical use on the more medical side. And certainly if people want to participate in research, that certainly could be of value to them too. And so we really came across this idea of a central depository, sequenced once, queried often, controlled by the user. And that eventually became Helix. And so I was fortunate to help found the company with my previous classmate, Justin Cow, who runs the commercial side, and a good friend of ours, Scott Burke, who's now the CTO of the company. It's been a real pleasure in the last couple of years to really focus on the scientific and clinical aspects of what we're doing and how do you really impact individuals from a personal sense, but also them in the clinical lives as well.
I find that it's fascinating, and it's so great to hear, there are so many founder stories that don't wind up in success. And the fact that the three co-founders are still with the organization and still passionate about the mission, several years in, that's pretty inspiring. I'm really curious to talk about some of your vision as you started the company. You talked about being able to sequence once and then have that be something that the individual can more or less carry around with them, that can be portable to them. Can you tell a little bit about how that works within Helix? You know, when you have people who come in directly to Helix or through one of your partners to have their sequencing done, tell me a little bit about what happens with that data, where it lives, how they access it, what their controls look like. Can you give us some background there?
Yeah, happy to. I think maybe I take a step back a bit, which is one of the core predicates for this business is the idea you can generate one very high quality sequence and have that be something that lives with you, almost that you can carry forward in time. Mm-hmm. And I think it is a more recent phenomenon that we can generate those data with confidence. And so if you really think about next-gen sequencing as a field, you know, the first genome was really complete in 2003. It took a couple more years to do the second person in the world. We were talking about doing 100 people in the world by 2010, 1,000 people around that time frame. And now we're talking about, about 1.5 million people being sequenced now in the last, mostly accelerated in the last, 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
So as you think about the continuum, right, there's been a massive explosion and massive growth in that field, largely driven by the technology development that Illumina has implemented, but also that we had to get really good at sequencing, learning how to do that well and do it at a clinical standard, I think, was something that the field had to just learn and get through. And so, one of the core predicates of Helix is you had to be able to generate this really high quality, clinical quality data set that you can make completely portable. And so one of the first things we did at Helix was we built a lab. And Helix now runs what is we think is, at least within the US, the largest clinical exome sequencing facility, certainly in the US, maybe even in the world. And one of the reasons why we did it that way is because we had to control the quality of this data set to have confidence that if we came back to it in 2 years, it would still be valid. So that was one of the big pieces. The second big change around how we thought about this business and how we thought about the platform is that you wanted to be able to come back to the data over time, but not in a holistic, like I want to come back to 100% of the data. It was only to come back to the data in a way, almost like in a question-driven way. So when we think about genomics at Helix, it's not necessarily about like we have a lot of genetics questions. I think we think a lot about what are the questions that either the individual has, the clinic has, or research has, and how does genetics help answer that question?
Okay.
And so when you think about the various applications like ancestry, that's rarely I don't think people are walking around being like, I have a genetic ancestry question. I think people are walking around saying, I have a question about who I am.
Yeah.
And genetics is a tool they use to answer that question. When you think about carrier screening, which is typically a test that's given to women who are, in their first pregnancy, who are trying to understand what diseases might be carried within their genome and that might be inherited by their child. The question isn't what are the inherited diseases I have. The question really is how do I have a healthy child? Right?
Sure.
And so we think a lot about where are the questions, and those questions typically are subparts of the genome. They're not whole genome questions. They're typically, hey, I have a question that queries 10 genes or 50 sites or whatever it happens to be. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of our platform building has been focused on how do you answer just the question you need to answer and not answer the 50 other questions you hadn't even thought about yet.
Right.
And so we focus the platform on how do you almost generate these in silico panels or fully digital panels of the genome and allow people to use that just for the answering the specific question. And so the way Helix works today is if an individual accesses a product or an application, those products access only the portions of the data required for the product. And so typically the way to think about it is health things only ask and look at things related to health in your genome. Fun things only look at fun things. You don't have a lot of cross. You don't have, companies are purely recreational, looking at a lot of things on the health side, et cetera. And part of that was to make it easy to answer the question. But the second part of that is it's privacy preserving for the individual. So they can also make their own individual decisions about the types of data they're willing to expose to parties they trust and how much of that data they're willing to expose.
Outstanding.
And so it's very much focused on, in Helix as an orientation, it's very much focused on what is best for the user.
Was that idea a part of your original vision to be able to create that digital representation that could be divided up into segments to, A, be targeted, but B, protect the privacy?
Yeah, I think it was. I like to believe that even, 5 years ago when we first started talking about this or even farther back, we had thought about exactly like this. I think it really did crystallize by the point we had founded the company, though, that in order for this to be successful in the long run, you needed a way for not only yourself, but for you to be like, my mom is here, my cousins are here, my spouse is here, my children are here. I need to feel good about that. Mm-hmm. And so we need to make sure that the consent processes, the privacy policies, the terms of service, all these things are supportive of that overall mission, that this should be a place that people trust, where they're going to have long-term relationships of where their genome is going to be held. And so that was a lot of the formulation of how we got the business started.
And yet it's still, as I understand it, a very different model from businesses that are genotyping as opposed to using next-gen sequencing, where they literally will just have enough data to serve their specific need for that moment, but either little or no more than that. In other words, it's not something that you can, do an ancestry test today and then 3 years later, do some sort of a health test or a carrier screening, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So we really focused on next-gen sequencing as the core technology versus genotyping because we wanted us to be future-facing, because we did believe the future of genomics is in next-gen, and that we would look back at the period where we said, oh, genotyping array was enough as a fairly low resolution time. And so next-gen sequencing, I think the way to think about relative to a genotyping array is if your DNA is a book, a genotyping array essentially is picking out single letters and trying to piece together the story. Sequencing allows you to read full sentences, full pages, full chapters. And so we thought that the completeness of having essentially your whole genome read, or proportions of your genome read that are relevant for genes, was a much better stance on a go-forward basis than starting with something more limited.
It takes a little bit of pressure off of you, Helix, because you don't have to anticipate every possible use case. That's something that can be done for years into the future and still go back to the same source, right?
That's absolutely right. So just as the genome being the unique feature being it's inherited doesn't change, it's a really unique set of data in which there's almost no time component to it, right? It's not different when you're 18 than when you're 5. Okay? Mm-hmm. The thing that is changing is knowledge. And so the idea that our scientific knowledge is advancing, clinical knowledge is advancing, if the consumer side is an all leverage the same data set, gives us a lot of flexibility to frankly not have to anticipate what the world's going to be like in 5 years, except to know that what we have today will be relevant.
Fantastic. And that is actually a great place for us to take a quick break. We're going to be right back with James Liu from Helix, so stick around.
Today's show is brought to you by Bluespire, a full-service digital marketing agency focused on complex and highly regulated industries of healthcare, senior living, and financial services. Rapid changes in the healthcare industry are causing consumers to seek out trusted advice, demand more transparency and access to information and content. With over 30 years of healthcare experience, Bluespire knows how to help you reach, communicate with, and gain trust from these consumers. We help you engage with the right content at every touch point, from the first symptom search to appointment scheduling through care management. Visit us at bluespiremarketing.com to learn how we can help you deliver relevant, engaging content through ever-changing touch points that matter.
And we are back on Data Point. We are talking today with James Liu from Helix. James, when we went into this break, we were talking a little bit about Helix's novel approach to the use of next-gen sequencing and the fact that it has the potential for essentially being future-proofed because the data is there, and as future applications are created or imagined, we can still go back to that sample. But one of the reasons that you're able to do that, to bring you back a little further in our interview, was you talked about a clinical quality sample and to be able to process that in your lab. Can you talk a little bit more about what clinical quality means in the context of exome sequencing?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think the first thing to think about actually is the types of use cases of the data that you want to enable. And that kind of drives the questions on quality side. And when we think about people using this data in not only for personal use for fun, but really for clinical decisions down the road. Like if someone finds out through a partner application or through a service or a clinical lab that's leveraging Helix data that they have a risk for, very high risk for a BRCA mutation that leads to breast cancer, people will make serious medical decisions based on those data. And so for us as an organization, we want to make sure the data is high quality as possible, and to make sure that people can make the right decisions based on those data. And so we just take that very seriously because we know that people will make life-changing decisions. And the reason why we talk a lot about clinical quality in order to reflect that is that we can certify the accuracy of all the calls or the varying calls coming off our data. We know the reproducibility. We know that data exquisitely because we run at such large scale. And we can build all our processes to make sure that everyone who gets a sequence-generated Helix gets a very high-quality bar that's reproducible across every person who walks in the door. And so just that level of comfort that you can use it again and again in all sorts of ways is the type of bar that we set internally and we think is the right bar externally as well for everyone to have.
It's as the more we talk about this, the more amazed I am that you are able to make this vision become a reality, because what you're describing with the kind of lab that you've created, that sounds like a much higher risk proposition for a new business than to have another lab do your sequencing for you. What was it that made you feel that this was the right way to go, even though I'm sure it's more expensive, probably took more time and more money? How did you know it was going to be worth it?
Well, I think first of all, we clearly could not have done this without great support from our investors and partners. So Illumina being a big supporter of the company, obviously we've had great investments. I think it's part of them all buying into this vision that we do think the genome will be almost something you do one time and really get to carry over and over again. And so if you do believe that model, then I think it makes sense to make the investments up front to ensure that you can use that, you can leverage that model over time. And so we were fortunate partly in our ability to take the vision, but also that we were willing to find great partners of ours to invest behind that vision. You're right, though. It is a capital-intensive business. And if you ever get the chance, you should come visit us in San Diego and get a look yourself. But it is, in many ways, we modeled the laboratory off some of the best-in-class manufacturing processes in the world. And very much for us, we process one really, really high-quality assay that we think encompasses the vast majority of use cases of the data today. And we only do that. And so we do one thing just really, really well. And that's a little bit different than other clinical labs, which typically are smaller and have very, very large test menus. So they run 10, 20, hundreds, thousands of different types of chemistry in the same laboratory,
sure,
which makes it harder to optimize the way we optimize here.
No, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I think as a consumer, as an individual, being able to put my trust in that, it feels a lot easier knowing the heavy focus on quality and security and repeatability that you obviously do. Yeah, that is pretty exciting. It feels like a long time ago, I asked you a question that I want to come back around to, which is really about the consumer and their ability to control what happens with their data. I wanted to come back and understand that a little bit better. Once I have sent a sample in, again, either directly to Helix or through one of your application partners, how do I access my data? How do you help the customer to understand what that data consists of and how it's stored and what their rights are with regard to accessing it and so forth?
Yep. So I think the first thing is Helix does control the end-to-end supply chain. So even if you came in through a partner, Helix is the one sending out all the kits and receiving them back. So we're very clear about what we call chain of custody, which is if we send something out, we want to know it went to the right person that came back to us in the right manner as well. So that's one part of our kind of quality system that we're also monitoring relative to including all the other things that are happening at the laboratory. In terms of access to data, it is very much, I think, when you look at the store, you look at the variety of things you can do, it's very much focused on what are the questions people have. And so people typically come in for ancestry type questions, they come in for carrier type questions, they come in for health questions, they come in for a variety of things. Some of them are purely recreational, some of them are very serious. We like the idea, and I think it's been proven now, is that experiences that are focused on contextualization of genetic data are better than just experiences that focus on genetic data. What I mean by that is people are often good at or better understanding the data when it's focused on a topic they care about in a way that they understand. And so when we think about the partner model, a lot of it is about generating the right type of content, the right type of education, the right type of experiences around how to think about that genetic data in your personal context. And one of the big motivations for setting up the store also is that we didn't believe Helix as an entity could be good at all those different use cases. We just don't think it's possible that you can be good at everything related to possibly providing content around genetics.
Mm.
And so we're very focused on this idea that there are focused applications people can use to help them answer the question they care about. And if they want to come back for more, there will be other applications at the time it's appropriate for them, and people can make their decisions at the time they want. Clearly there are people who are power users who want to access full data sets. That's an option too. You can, have a data download option on Helix, so you can certainly get your data. We find that, almost no one does that because frankly, the data are unintelligible to almost everyone.
Right.
You have to be a real power user, right? It's not different than like you technically can download all your data from Facebook. I think the number of people doing that is very, very low, right? It's just unintelligible to most people. So we think people have the right. It's our philosophy. People have the right, but it's also, our goal is really to make sure people generate value from it and understanding, not necessarily just have raw data.
No, that totally makes sense. And I guess one of the things that I am really curious about, and I think we can probably close out our conversation with this, you referenced the fact that as a part of your doctoral program that you were working a lot with health records and trying to do some work to understand and make sense of health records at a large scale. And certainly I think when you have the potential to couple genomic data with health record data, for example, it paints in some ways a much more complete picture of an individual's health. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your work there and whether the health record might be something that you come back around to at some point.
Yeah, I'm happy to. The reason I really like health record data, and I still continue to really like health record data, is that the data are being generated every single day and every single time people come into the clinic, right? So the data is actually a byproduct of the normal flow of healthcare in America.
Yep.
And it is frankly a massive opportunity and frankly a missed opportunity for many years, and that the data were not digitized, but now they are. And the second one is they're used only for clinical, but they're not used for research. And I think there is a big opportunity in driving improvements in healthcare, both on the operational side, but also just novel discoveries through leveraging those data in the right way. So I think it just remains a really, really untapped resource. In terms of the ability to drive genetics and health record data, and something that we've been thinking about, and we're starting to look at with some of our health system collaborations, is what are the primary use cases where those data together generate a lot of insight. And I think there are a couple things that, just to really to highlight there. The first one is there's a really good opportunity, and I think it's already being validated, that we will discover new therapeutics and new diagnostics by combining those data. And what we mean by that is there's clearly people who have disease in the system that is not explainable using other techniques, but maybe explainable using genetics, and that those may end up being eventually drug targets down the road that help us really transform the treatment of XYZ disease.
Sure.
So I think that's one of the primary use cases, which is around discovery. The second one is really around risk. And much of genetics is a prediction of a disease that may occur in the future. And, genetics is only a portion of the picture. I think we would be remiss in saying genetics is the whole story. In most cases, actually, genetics is just a portion of the story. Obviously, environment matters a lot. Those data have historically been completely separated. And is there an opportunity for comprehensive risk assessment, given what we know about your lifestyle, either through questions that we're asking you in the clinic or maybe even through trackables, plus genetic data? Does that data together provide us a much better view of comprehensive risk and how to, frankly, defer or eliminate risk by making different choices on either your treatment plan or your lifestyle? So how do we kind of use that as a mechanism to predict and then use that to mitigate? I think that's the second major opportunity.
That is
the third
extremely exciting. And I'm sorry to cut you off because I'm dying to know what the third one is now.
I actually think there's just one generally in operational efficiency, which is individuals who have part of it's the risk assessment. But if you focus your resources on those individuals who have the highest risk, that are most likely to have disease, that are most likely to benefit from intervention, you transform the cost curve in healthcare. And I think that's one of the big problems today is that, the cost curve constantly is upwards to the right. So I think it's something we just need to think about a lot more about, particularly as we bring genetics into the preventative realm. And how do we leverage it really for focusing on individuals to make sure they stay healthy and not just help them when they are already sick?
That's a really good point. I know there are so many conditions where there's a lot of trial and error in the treatment process. And if you could eliminate a few of the trials on the basis of genomic data, combined with health record data to get to the right solution faster, that would be, that has great health outcome, but also great financial outcome as well.
Yep. I think the earliest case of this, which is more genetically driven, but is talked about in the clinical system, something called a diagnostic. So these are individuals who have constantly that make them very sick, and we have no understanding why, and run through batteries and batteries and batteries of testing. And the evidence is now emerging that early sequencing in these cases can be dramatic in terms of avoidance of all that other imaging and testing, all these other things, because it allows you to get to the answer quicker. And I think that's just a very easy to bite off first example of where that is. And I think that's kind of where the model will go over time, which is how do you leverage this in almost a first line way? Genetics becomes a standard of care used first before you start doing a bunch of other things.
Well, I think that is a fantastic place to leave this conversation, James. It has been really enlightening for me, and I know for our listeners as well. I'm so grateful for you spending the time with us to share your experience, and hope that the next few years are just as exciting and fulfilling for you at Helix as the last several have been. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to the Data Point Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please do rate, review, and share it with your social network. It means a lot. And if you have ideas for show topics or guests, please email them to me at greg@healthquant.health or send a direct message to @ChiMoose on Twitter. That's CHIMOOSE on Twitter. For more information about this show or any of the terrific healthcare podcasts in the Touchpoint Media Network, check them out at touchpoint.health. See you next time.
This has been a Touchpoint Media production. To learn more about this show and others like it, please visit us online at touchpoint.health.